Yeah, it's not you. She thinks it's a person. This is ridiculous.
Is that for her keys? Is that for your keys?
Yes.
If you lose them now, I swear, you're banned. If we go digging through another freezer.
Oh, it was a misorder that Taylor got, and the company said, keep on.
Oh, she don't.
Don't have a company name on it.
Oh, got you.
We think there's about 50 of them. Put the groceries in. They're big.
All right, we'll get started. Tom, who keeps up with what psalm we're on, is not here, so we're just gonna have to guess. I think we're on Psalm 21. Tom texted me and said we either are on 20 or we did 20, and I know we didn't do 19 last week, so I think we're on 21. If we've already done 21, just make me feel good about myself and act like we haven't done 21. And then we'll do 22. I will not be here next Sunday, so Kevin will be taking the class next Sunday, and then I will be back sometime the following week. Graduation.
Awesome.
Gotta get all the way up to Oklahoma. Anyway, so let's pray through Psalm 21. In your strength, the King rejoices, O Lord, and in your help, how greatly he exalts. You have given him his heart's desire, and have not withheld the request of his lips. For you meet him with rich blessings, you set a crown of fine gold on his head. He asked you for life, you gave it to him, length of days forever and ever. His glory is great through your help, splendor and majesty you bestow on him. You bestow on him blessings forever, you make him glad with the joy of your presence. For the king trusts in the Lord, and through the steadfast love of the Most High he shall not be moved. Your hand will find out all your enemies, your right hand will find out those who hate you. You will make them like a fiery furnace when you appear. The Lord will swallow them up in his wrath, and fire will consume them. You will destroy their offspring from the earth, and their children from among humankind. If they plan evil against you, if they devise mischief, they will not succeed. For you will put them to flight. You will aim at their faces with the bows. Be exalted, O Lord, in your strength. We will sing and praise your power. Lord, we pray for your presence and your Spirit to be with us this morning. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Before we get started, I just remembered, Sheree, did we hit the auto tracking?
I did.
Is it okay? Good. We've got some technology that's actually working. I hold my breath every time we try something new. So, all right. Gospel of Luke. Let's go to Luke. Let's go to Luke 22. My goal is to finish talking about Jesus as Messiah in Luke today. That is my goal. We don't have a lot left, but at the same time, I have 5 points, and it's taken us 2 months to get through 2 of them. So we don't have much left, but we're going to try to finish the Gospel of Luke, and we've been talking about Jesus as prophet. There are some other themes in the Gospel of Luke. Luke has the theme of forgiveness. Luke has the theme of money. Luke has the theme of inclusion. He's got the theme of the Spirit as well. We're going to talk all about all of those beginning in, 2 weeks from today, when we start a series on the Lord's Supper and the Gospel of Luke. We will hit those other things. I don't want to talk about them when we're talking about Jesus as the Messiah in Luke. So we're hitting on this idea of Jesus as a prophet. We looked at his baptism, where Jesus is anointed as a prophet. We looked at the description of his ministry in Luke chapter 4, where Jesus describes his ministry by reading from Isaiah the prophet. He's going to fulfill the things that Isaiah the prophet has spoken about. We looked at the story of the sinful woman and Simon the Pharisee in Luke chapter 7, where the sinful woman comes in and anoints Jesus' feet with oil, washes them with her tears, dries them with her hair, and how Simon the Pharisee responds to that by saying, if this man, speaking about Jesus, if Jesus was truly a prophet, he would know what kind of woman it was that was touching his feet. And Luke tells us that Jesus, knowing Simon's thoughts, responds to him. And we have the whole discussion about the inclusion of this woman. And what Luke is doing there is he's showing the irony that Simon doesn't think that Jesus is a prophet because he's interacting with a sinful woman. But Jesus, reading Simon's mind, knowing his thoughts, actually proves that he is a prophet. And so what Luke is doing is he's showing, no, Simon's wrong. Jesus is actually a prophet. But as a prophet, Jesus' prophetic ministry does not exclude people like this sinful woman, but it includes people like this sinful woman. And so thinking about Jesus as prophet now leads us to his crucifixion. Luke chapter 22. Let's go down to verse 63. Now the men who were holding Jesus began to mock him and beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? They kept heaping many other insults on him. So think about what Luke is doing here. He's presented Jesus as this prophet. Go back to Luke chapter 9 for a moment. This will help lead us to what we're talking about. So, Luke presents Jesus as a prophet. So, he is born, he's anointed at his baptism as a prophet. He defines his ministry as a prophet. You have other people that believe he is a prophet. Simon the Pharisee seems to have believed that Jesus was a prophet, but others become very skeptical because Jesus is acting like a prophet that they're not comfortable with. He's acting like a prophet that they're not really expecting. But Luke presents the crowds generally thinking that Jesus is a prophet. So in Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 18, we have Peter's declaration of who Jesus is. Once when Jesus was praying alone with only the disciples near him, he asked them, who do the crowds say that I am? They answered, John the Baptist, which people believe John to be a prophet, but others Elijah, so another specific prophet, and still others that one of the ancient prophets has arisen. So the average person out in the street, or the crowds that were following Jesus, listening to Jesus, the average person, Luke tells us, think that Jesus is a prophet. They don't know what kind of prophet. They don't know which prophet. Is he John the Baptist? Is he Elijah? Is he another prophet risen from the grave? Is he his own unique prophet? They don't really know, but everyone believes that Jesus is a prophet. So Luke begins his gospel by identifying Jesus' ministry as a prophetic one. Throughout the gospel, we see people such as the crowds identifying Jesus as a prophet. And then we get to the crucifixion account. And those that are beating Jesus ask Jesus to prophesy. So you see this theme of Jesus as a prophet flow through. And what Luke is doing, I think, is he's doing something very similar to what Mark is doing. If you remember when we talked about Jesus in Mark, Jesus is the suffering Messiah, which is odd because I mentioned that nobody before Jesus believed that the Messiah was to suffer. That was not a belief that Jewish people had. This was something unique to Jesus. And so Mark goes out of his way to show us that Jesus is the Messiah, and not that he's the Messiah who suffered, but that he is the Messiah because he suffered. In Mark's gospel, Jesus' suffering is necessary for him to be Messiah. Luke's doing something similar. Jesus is a prophetic Messiah, and in Luke, for Jesus to suffer, for Jesus to die, is to prove that he is a prophet. And so we see Luke bring this idea of prophecy back into his gospel there in the crucifixion account by saying that those that were beating Jesus were mocking him as a prophet. They were saying, "You're not really a prophet. If you were, tell us who it is who just struck you." Luke is saying, no, in fact, in that moment, while the guards might think that Jesus is not a prophet, we know, those of us reading Luke writing, we know that in that moment we see Jesus as a prophet because he's suffering in this way. It connects back, I'm trying to think of where this is said in Luke. I want to say Luke 11. This takes us back to a statement that Jesus makes in Luke chapter 11. Yes, beginning in verse 37, Jesus has a meal with a Pharisee who remains unnamed. And at this meal, he gives 3 woes to the Pharisees, and he gives 3 woes to the lawyers. Verse 47, "Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your ancestors killed. So you are witnesses and approve of the deeds of your ancestors, for they killed them and you built their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some whom they will kill and persecute, so that this generation may be charged with the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be charged against this generation." Jesus says that the people of Israel have a history of killing the prophets. You go back and just read through the Old Testament, you see that that's something that Israel does at times. God sends them a prophet. They don't like what the prophet has to say, and so they kill the prophet. And Jesus is accusing the lawyers here of following in that same tradition. He's saying, in the same way that your ancestors killed the prophets, you too will kill a prophet. Talking about himself. I am a prophet. I am one that has been sent by God, and you will be responsible, or at least you will take part in killing me, just like your ancestors killed the prophets of old. And so that kind of comes to fruition there in the crucifixion account, where Jesus is mocked for being a prophet. You're not really a prophet. But in that moment, we see them treating Jesus as prophet in the same way that the old prophets of the Old Testament, were treated. Any thoughts, questions about?
In this version, it says he was blindfolded. I never have noticed that anywhere else. Is it?
I believe that is a Lucan thing. I think it's just in Luke.
No,
I don't remember it being in the other accounts. Because that's significant for how they're mocking him as prophet, right? You can't see, and we're going to hit you, and you tell us who it was that did it, right? They're playing a game at Jesus' expense. And what's interesting about Jesus, right, is he doesn't choose to play in that game, which he could have. Again, as a reader, it's like we know that Jesus is a prophet. Like, he could have played that game and won. It's kind of like the song that we sing, he could have called 10,000 angels. in a unique position as we're reading the story, because we already know how the story ends. We know what happens 3 days after this takes place, right? That the tomb is found empty. So we know who Jesus is. We know that he's a prophet, even as he's being mocked as a wannabe prophet, if you will. Any other thoughts?
To me, it's just that he's just suffering in silence. He's not commenting, he's not saying anything back to them, he's not resisting. He's just taking it.
So here's something interesting about that I had never noticed. Let's see, when have any of y'all ever come across the name Bart Ehrman before? Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is, I want to say he's at North Carolina University in Chapel Hill. He is a New Testament, Gospels, historical Jesus scholar. He's not a Christian. He was a Christian. He's not a Christian anymore. But he is one of the most world-renowned Gospel, historical Jesus scholars. I was reading a book that's a semi-debate, more like a discussion between him and a New Testament scholar by the name of Craig Evans, who is a believer. So they are both two of the best historians in the world when it comes to Jesus and the Gospels. Their approach to it, though, because of believer versus non-believer, is very different. But Ehrman pointed something out that I thought was interesting, and it has to do with that idea of the silence of Jesus. When you go and you read Mark's account, in Mark's account, Jesus is completely silent. Like throughout the whole thing, he doesn't say anything. In Matthew and Luke, it's a little bit different. Jesus is still relatively quiet, but you'll notice in Luke, I'm in chapter 23, verse 46, Jesus is crucified and he cries out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. If we go over to Matthew's account, Matthew 27, and about 3 o'clock, I'm in Matthew 27, verse 46. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling Elijah." There's a prophet reference. Again, at once one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah comes to save him." Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. So, we get kind of different vantage points, different emphases between the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, on what is happening at Jesus' crucifixion. Luke also has, in some manuscripts, you've probably, I'm sure you're familiar with this, when Jesus forgive them, for they know not what they do. Not to burst anybody's bubble, but that's not original to the Gospel of Luke. In my Bible, it's now reserved in a footnote. Newer Bibles reserve it in a footnote. It was added in later. So you have Mark, where Jesus is mostly silent. You have Matthew, where Jesus talks about being forsaken. You have Luke, where Jesus is mostly quiet, but at the end he gives up his spirit. In Luke, Jesus is presented more as a willing participant than he is in the other Gospels. Because Luke doesn't have the forsaken thing, right? So you think about Jesus being completely silent. It's not just that Jesus is allowing it to happen, but perhaps you could think about it as some of them, maybe even Mark presents Jesus as in a little bit of shock, a little bit more uncomfortable than Luke does. Jesus is going through it. He's remaining silent, but he's not as willing of a participant as he is in the way that Luke's looking at it, because we don't have into your hands I commend my spirit. But in Luke, Jesus is a very willing participant. So he's silent, particularly in Luke, because he knows, and he knows in all the Gospels, but he knows that this is not only where he's supposed to go, but think about the prophet thing. He knows this is what happens to prophets. Like, you don't enter into the job of being a prophet if you're not prepared to die as a prophet, because Jesus knows this is what Israel does to the prophets. This is what they've always done. He says that earlier. And so Jesus knows this is what they're going to do to me as a prophet. He knows not only that this is necessary, but he knows that it's what happens to a prophet. Right? Any other thoughts? I've got one final story I want us to look at. This is my favorite story. Luke 24. This is the final story before Jesus' ascension. The road to Emmaus. Luke 24, beginning in verse 13. This is a rather lengthy story. Now on the same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the Scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the Scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." And they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of bread. So I want you to put yourself into the shoes of these two disciples that are on this road. Chapter 24 opens up with the discovery of the empty tomb. It's the third day after Jesus' death. Some female followers of Jesus go to the tomb to treat Jesus' body with spices. Think about this. Jesus dies on a Friday. Saturday is the Sabbath, meaning you can't work. Jewish days are from sundown to sundown. So the Sabbath starts sundown on Friday and goes till sundown on Saturday. So Jesus dies sometime late Friday afternoon, because they have to hurry and get him into a tomb before the Sabbath. Otherwise, he'd have to stay up there on the cross until we get to Sunday, if you remember the story. So they go, they put him in a new tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Jewish council. That's a fascinating story for another day. They go and they put Jesus in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. They get all of that set, and then the sun goes down on Friday. It's now the Sabbath. They can't work, they can't do anything. That carries over till sundown from sundown on Friday. Takes us all the way to sundown on Saturday. So, Sunday morning comes. The sun now comes up on Sunday. It is now time, they now have the ability to go and treat Jesus' body with spices that they had not been able to do prior because of the Sabbath. So the women go and they find the tomb empty. In Luke's gospel, 2 angels appear to them and tell them that Jesus is risen. The women go back to the disciples and the other followers. It seems that after Jesus has died, his followers they either scatter or they all eventually kind of huddle up to figure out what comes next. So these women go back to the huddled up group of disciples. They would have included now 11 of the apostles because Judas has already hanged himself. So you have the 11 apostles, you have other disciples. They go back and they tell them this story. Then some of the disciples run to the tomb to see if what these women have said is true, and they too find the tomb empty. But at this point, the story of the road to Emmaus happens later on Sunday. So we think Sunday afternoon, Sunday late afternoon. You have 2 of the disciples who were there for all this going on Sunday morning, and now Sunday afternoon, they need to go make this trip. Them making the trip in the first place is very interesting. Nobody can quite figure out why they would be making this trip. It doesn't quite make sense, but they're making this trip later on Sunday. As they're making this trip, everyone's kind of in a place of limbo. Nobody knows what to make of the events, because as they say, they define Jesus as a prophet, mighty indeed. That's who they believe Jesus to be, a prophet. That's who Luke is presenting Jesus as. That's important. We're supposed to believe Jesus is a prophet. So they say Jesus is a prophet, mighty indeed, but Jesus has died. So these two things don't quite work together. Jesus is a prophet, but Jesus has died. They don't quite know what to make any of that. The tomb has been found empty earlier on in the day, and the women claim that angels told them that Jesus has been raised from the dead. They know that other of their number have gone and seen that the tomb was empty. So everybody believes that they're empty, but it doesn't seem that anybody knows what to make of the women's report. The women believe it's empty because Jesus has been raised from the dead. At this point in time, everybody else is a little skeptical. They don't quite know what to make of the empty tomb. And so in Luke 24, the body of Jesus takes central stage. It's Jesus' body that is crucified. It's Jesus' body that is put in the tomb. It's Jesus' body that is now missing, and nobody knows what's happened to it. Some think that he's raised. Some think maybe the body was stolen. We don't actually know, but not everybody believes that Jesus was raised. So we don't know who Jesus is. We thought we did, but then he died, and now we don't know who he is for sure. And we don't know where Jesus' body is. They're in a very difficult situation. Imagine that this is you and how you're feeling. We're told that as they were walking down the road, and they were discussing all these things, the idea is that they were debating with each other. Maybe this happened, maybe that happened, maybe this is what we should believe. But at the end of the day, they're sad. Jesus has died, and the body's missing. And we don't know what to do. And then Jesus' body shows up on the road. It's the answer that they're looking for, but they can't recognize Jesus. The answer, the irony should not be missed in the story, that they are arguing about the body of Jesus to the body of Jesus.
He's right with it.
They're talking to Jesus about how sad they are that they don't know where Jesus is. And he's standing right there. But they can't see it. And the reason they can't see it, I think, people have debated about what causes them not to be able to see. I think they're unable to see because they're slow of heart. They haven't fully come to grasp what it means for Jesus to be a prophet. They confess, Jesus is a prophet, mighty indeed. But when Jesus talks to them, he realizes they don't know what that means. They're saying it, but Jesus is like, I don't think you know what it is that you're saying. And so what does Jesus do? He starts with Moses and all the prophets. So they claim Jesus is a prophet, but they don't understand what that means. And so what does Jesus do? He says, well, let's go back and read the prophets. Let's read Elijah. Let's read Jeremiah. Let's read Isaiah. Let's read Elisha. Let's go back and read the prophets. And they go back and they read the prophets, and what Jesus does is he now leads them to an understanding of Jesus was a prophet, mighty indeed, and so he had to suffer. Remember what Jesus has already pointed out? The prophets historically have suffered. They have been killed. And Jesus makes the point, was it not necessary for Jesus as the prophetic Messiah to suffer and die? Things begin to now make sense for them. Okay, now we're in their shoes. Okay, we're sad. But now we've got one of our problems figured out. This man has opened up the scriptures to us. And we now know that he was a prophet. He was the Messiah. That the whole suffering, death thing makes sense. But they still don't know where Jesus' body is. They should. It's right there. But they don't know where Jesus' body is. The body is still missing. And notice, when they are able to recognize the body of Jesus when they break bread with Jesus. The language that Jesus took bread, he broke it, and he gave it to them is the exact same wording that is used in Luke 22 in the story of the Lord's Supper. And when we take of the Lord's Supper, what does the bread represent? The body. It was taking of Jesus' body that they are able to see Jesus' body. They now know where Jesus is. They now know for sure what all has happened, and then Jesus disappears. I say that they're not taking the Lord's Supper in Luke 24, but Jesus wants us, Luke, in using that wording like that, wants us to go back to the Lord's Supper and to make a connection between the breaking of bread and the opening of eyes in order to see Jesus as he is, as the prophet who has died, but more importantly, as the prophet who has been resurrected. Question? Comment?
Well, and the fact that they were just, and then they were, when he was immediately gone, I mean, that was just another miracle. I mean, he's here in person, you know, we've been talking with him all afternoon on walking down the road, and now he's just gone from our midst, and then they were said how, where our heart's not burning in us the whole time, but they still didn't get it. They didn't get it to that moment. And then the fact that they immediately they got it, and then it took them all afternoon to get wherever they were going, and they jetted back. So they probably ran through half the night to get back to tell the others about, oh yeah, this is real.
Yeah, they had to go back. And what happens when they get back? They find Jesus has also appeared to Peter. They're not the only ones who've experienced the risen Jesus. I like that you point out the burning of their hearts on the road. That's interesting how Jesus is able to make an impact on them before they even know that it's Jesus making the impact on him. We're going to talk about the Lord's Supper over the next couple of weeks, beginning when I get back.
Well, that same thing happens today.
Yes. And that's one of the arguments that I made in my thesis. I'm not trying to jump to the sermon series that we're going to do, but one of the arguments that I made, I'm in arguing for open communion, opening the table to everyone, is that not only when we sit around the Lord's table do we experience the risen Jesus, just like the disciples on the road to Emmaus did when they sat down with Jesus, but the Lord's Supper can function for people, for us, for the non-believer, for whoever it is. It can function in the way that this meal functions with these two disciples, right? It can open people's eyes. It can allow us to encounter Jesus where our hearts burn, right? Something happens within us, even when we don't know what's happening or why it's happening or who it is that is causing it to happen. And to me, that's the important thing about everything that we do as a church. But for me, that's what makes the Lord's Supper so special, because it's a special encounter with Jesus. It's not the only place that we encounter Jesus, but I do believe it is a special encounter with Jesus. And I think the Gospel of Luke, and this story in particular, demonstrates for us that not only are we transformed by encountering Jesus, but I think this story illustrates that anyone who encounters Jesus is transformed. Their hearts burn as a result of that encounter. That goes back to some of the stuff we've talked about evangelism before, that it's not our job to do the converting, that God does all the hard work. Sometimes it's as simple as allowing people to encounter Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, you is what causes their heart to burn. You are the ones that open their eyes. My job is just to invite them to the table. Sometimes all people need, and sometimes where Jesus is drawing them, is just come sit down at a table with me. What does Jesus do? I'm preaching my sermon series now. What does Jesus do throughout the Gospel of Luke? He eats with people. He wants to be at the table with them. And when Jesus is at the table, special things happen. And it's beyond our control. It's beyond our ability. Sometimes it's as simple as, let's sit at the table with Jesus together and let's see what Jesus does. This is maybe not the best illustration, but this is what came to my mind, so we're going to roll with it. It's like if you go to a haunted house and decide to play with Ouija board. It's like, let's open up this Ouija board, let's light some candles, let's sit around, and let's just see what happens. Now, right, generally, nothing's probably going to happen, but it's different when you're sitting around the table with Jesus, and let's just sit at the table with Jesus and see what happens. In that case, we can be certain that every time something will happen, something miraculous, something beyond our abilities will happen. And it's all about an encounter with Jesus. Especially, I think people, believers, non-believers, find themselves in this place of limbo like these disciples do. Things happen in life and we just don't know what to do. We don't know what to think. We don't know what to make of them. We don't know where to go. We don't know who to turn to. And it's in those moments that encounters with Jesus, I think, can reorient us, just like they do for these disciples. These disciples did not know what to do next. They did not know what to think about what's happened. And by sitting at a table with Jesus, everything becomes clear. Everything makes sense. What they are to do, what they need to do, now becomes obvious to them by encountering with Jesus. And like you said, that's the same thing that happens today. We still encounter Jesus like the disciples on the road to Emmaus encountered Jesus. Maybe not exactly the same way, but we still encounter Jesus, and that encounter does the same thing for us that it does for these disciples as we hopefully recognize Jesus as the prophetic Messiah.
And the question, the disciples on the road, they were not the original 12, 11 apostles. Okay, they were
an
outer circle.
Yeah, they were. So you have.
They were believers and.
Yeah, because you have at least 4 circles. You've got the inner circle, Peter, James, and John, that are right there, and then you have the 12, and then you have disciples, and then you have crowds that follow them. So all of these are a part of the crowds, but you get closer to Jesus, and you get more committed. Kind of the idea is as you get closer to the
And the
center.
women fit into the disciples?
Yeah, they would fit in. They would fit into the disciples. So when Jesus is killed, the crowd scatter and the disciples kind of come together to figure out what's next.
So that'd be like when we hear someone in our family passes away, what does the family do? The family gathers together, huddles, trying to figure it all out, and oh my gosh, I just talked to him, I just saw him, you're trying to talk through it and sort through your feelings. And
So that's a good example. Think about moments like that where something happens, whatever it is, and we huddle together, friends, family. Death is the perfect example of a time when people come together. We come and huddle up, and we try to make sense of the events. And I think in those moments, what happens in this story stands true of Jesus will show up. The problem is sometimes we're like the disciples and we don't see him. He's standing over in the corner, but we don't realize that he's there.
Well, in Luke it says that even when he's talking to them after they break bread and they see that it's him, they still don't understand everything until he opens their eyes. And then all of a sudden, all the scripture makes sense. It's kind of like when we're baptized. All of a sudden, you take on the Spirit, and all of a sudden things start to make more sense, and your faith grows, and it's the same kind of thing. But even the disciples, even though they're sitting there eating bread with him, they knew it was him, but nothing made sense until he opened their eyes and they understood all the scriptures.
Let me see, I think this is, okay, yeah. So after the road to Emmaus, Jesus appears to them again, at the end of Luke 24. In verse 37, they were startled and terrified, and thought that they were seeing a ghost. And Jesus says to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. While in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. That's always stuck out to me. Jesus has talked to them, Jesus has explained things to them. Jesus has preached to them. Jesus has allowed them to touch the holes in his hands and his feet. And that fills them with joy, but they're all still disbelieving. They still don't know what to believe. And I think we live in that tension of experiencing Jesus and still not believing, still having doubts, still having questions. If sometimes we talk about doubting or not understanding as a bad thing, but if the disciples who could touch the nail holes, it didn't relieve their doubts, I'm very sure that we're not going to have all of our doubts and all of our questions and all of the moments where we don't believe fixed. I think what sustains us is those encounters with Jesus, that work of the Holy Spirit that works inside of us and moves us towards deeper belief and deeper faith, moves us away from our unbelief, but in this age, maybe not completely wiping it out, but we still can, even when we're unsure, even when we don't know, we still encounter Jesus. We still have the Spirit working in us. All right, I'm way over time, but that's it for Luke. I have a few other things I want to say about Messiah. We'll